Most people probably know that. I didn't know in that sense.
Be sure to tell them about Luke.
Okay.
And Beth is ill, so that's why she's not here. And Carrie's graduating, so that's why she's not here. What about Holly will be here?
All right. Thank you. I get this pernicious evil line from Dr. Sedgwick's. It was grade equivalency scores that he called the pernicious evil. But in this case, I want to talk about the pernicious evils of check boxes. I know it sounds really dry, but it's actually an interesting story. Dr. Sedgwick's already covered all of my background there, but he didn't talk about my dissertation, and especially the dissertation title. This is what I wanted to call my dissertation. I had developed a measure of self-efficacy for pre-service teachers regarding technology integration, and I wanted to do a validation of it. But once you get into validity theory, you understand that validity isn't something that you can show in and of itself. You can only show evidence of validity. So my title got a little longer. But then the more you get into validity, the more you understand that validity is not a property of the scale or the measure. What's it a property of?
Interpretation.
Interpretations or inferences. So, added inferences. The problem with inferences, it's really messy, is that different people will draw different inferences from the same set of data. So for example, if I inferred from somebody's SAT scores that, or if I inferred that the SAT scores indicated how well somebody would do their first year in college, that's a pretty valid inference. But if I inferred that it was a summary of their secondary education performance, that's not a valid inference. So it's not just inferences of an instrument, but you have to specify that those inferences are required by the intended uses of that step. So that's the whole length of my dissertation. And I actually did try to pass off some shorthand in the body of the text and say, well, I'll just refer to the validity of the instrument, and this is what I really mean. Dr. Sedgwick wouldn't let me do that, and my dissertation grew by 5 pages because I had to go in and fill in all the verbiage. But what did I learn? Well, from this, I learned to be very cautious of the terminology I use, to be very precise in my writing and in my speech when I talk about measurement issues. I also learned to be very curious about sources of invalidity, threats to validity. What could be happening somewhere in this measurement process that would make it so that my inferences were no longer valid. And that actually served me really well because the story of my life has been interpreting data from measures that I didn't design. And this goes back to when I was a graduate student and started working for the National Middle East Language Resource Center, which is a federally funded consortium of 20 universities that teach Middle East languages. It's headquartered here at BYU. Kirk Belknap is the PI on that grant, and he brought me in to do measurement stuff. Well, actually, they had already designed and administered a 200-item survey to over 1,000 students nationwide studying Middle Eastern languages, and they needed me to come in and make some sense out of the data. It would have been really nice to have been at the table when they designed the instrument, right? While I was working for the NMELRC, the Social Science Research Council called us up and said, hey, we used a Freedom of Information Act request to get the federal database that tracks all of Title VI activities. Title VI is Foreign Language and Area Studies. It's part of the Higher Education Act. And we don't have anybody that can do anything with the database. But we understand you have some people who know databases. Can we work something out? So Dr. Belknap paid me to actually reverse engineer this government database and provide some results to the Social Science Research Council on the agreement that we would also get to use the data. Well, it didn't take me very long getting into the data to realize that it was never really meant to be read. It was just meant for, to make the programs report something. They weren't really ever going to do any sort of analysis on the data. Despite that, the Social Science Research Council signed me as a contractor, and I went to several meetings out there in New York City, which was nice because my parents were serving a mission there at the time. I saw my parents more on their mission than I did the 2 years before their mission. And I worked for them for about 4 or 5 more years, and I had a good time doing it. Then one day, when I was still a graduate student, I was over in the IP&T lab. The phone rings and it's for me, which is a little odd if it's not my wife. And it's somebody from the National Research Council. Never heard of it. Have any of you heard of the National Research Council? Okay, Dr. Sutter says. Okay. I just worked for the Social Science Research Council. I worked for a language resource center. So I just thought, okay, this is somebody else who needs some help. They wanted to use that same database that I had just found was pretty much unusable. And I told them on the phone, no, there's really nothing in that database. It's really hard to get anything out of it, and what you get out of it doesn't have a lot of meaning. So, you know, I'm going to advise you not to use it. Well, she said, it's part of our charge that for this evaluation we need to use that database. So if you could be in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, we would really appreciate it. And she said, unfortunately, we don't have time to get you hired or to get you a ticket, so you're going to have to pay your own way and we'll reimburse you. And I'm thinking, excuse me? But what the heck? So got out the credit card, paid $900 for a ticket to fly to Denver to DC. Got delayed in Denver. And so when when I land in DC, I've only got like 45 minutes to get to the meeting. So I'm not going to go to the hotel that they had set up for me, just get a cab, take me to this place. We're driving around, we can't find it. It's right off the mall in DC. So what's it called? It's the National Research Council. It's got to be around here somewhere. Finally, we stop at a stoplight, and I see this sign. And I read the last line, National Research Council. It's part of the National Academies. And I suddenly realized I was very grateful I had worn my suit to this meeting. Sure enough, I walk in 5 minutes late. The receptionist takes my bag, directs me into this room. Giant table set up in a U formation, photographers in the pit in the middle, microphones and nameplates all around, so I find mine, sit down, turn off the microphone, and sure, it's hunky-dory. I'm looking around. This committee had former ambassadors on it. It had an executive from Shell Oil on it. And this was a congressionally mandated evaluation of Title VI of the Higher Education Act. And I wound up working for them for over a year, analyzing, again, data that I had nothing to do with. So all of this made me really sensitive when, as a professor, I was asked to serve on a committee that was evaluating the library's performance. And they had purchased a third-party survey, I won't mention its name, and had just gotten back the results and wanted my help analyzing the results to see what we could say. This is, this recurring theme in my life. The last section of that survey asked respondents to check the different pieces of technology that they owned. The idea being that if the library is going to offer services that leverage technology that the students supposedly have at their disposal, we need to make sure our students actually have that technology. And some of these numbers came up really low. And what I realized was that students weren't necessarily checking all the ones that they owned or had access to. Because a smartphone they wouldn't see as an MP3 player, even though it can play MP3s. All right? And so I started to wonder what the blank checkboxes meant. What did they really mean? Are they actually, no, I don't own that? Are they, I'm too lazy to market? Are they, I don't know what this technology is? What are they? You see, the model for a checkbox or any other kind of, or similar type of item format is that you have a true construct or a true score, right? In this case, if the respondent owns or doesn't own that piece of technology. And if they do own it, they check it. If they don't own it, they don't check it. And everyone's happy, the data's accurate, right? Well, of course, we have this problem in that, in reality, there's something called non-response. And checkboxes confound non-response with negative response. Okay, provided that the default is unchecked. Right? If the user or the respondent doesn't respond, you're going to assume that means no. But it could mean a whole lot of other things. And Dr. Sudricks has some excellent references on non-response because it was Sudman, I believe, was one of your professors at Indiana, who's written a seminal work on non-response.
He was the one who smoked in class. In Illinois, not Indiana.
Oh, Illinois, okay. So, but if you look into non-response studies and theory, they don't really address this issue of conflating two different true values with the observed value. So really quickly, a history of the checkbox. It really came into fashion after World War II, as so many things did in education and in society. It was returning soldiers who had been working very much in a regimented environment. They came back and brought with them ideas and expectations from the military lifestyle. NASA in the space race actually championed the checklist. And this is a quote from the Apollo 13 movie, where he asks, how long does it take to power up the lunar module? What does he say? 3 hours by the checklist. Well, we don't have that much time, and so they have to power it up without the checklist. But the idea of going through and checking things off as you did them. The checkbox was actually innovative and did improve accuracy in some cases. This is a study from 1984 looking at reported complications and malformations in childbirth. And they found that for the checkbox formatted items, they actually saw an increase in the percentage that were reported on the birth certificates, but for the open-ended ones, they did not. It was flat. The idea being that if it's not suggested to you explicitly on the form, there's a high likelihood you're going to omit it. But if we put a checkbox and we make you check whether or not there was preeclampsia, we're actually going to make you remember whether or not there was. So that the physician filling this out, or the nurse, can actually, it improved accuracy a great deal over just simply list all complications. However, checkboxes also introduced this ambiguity, what I call the conflation effect. In Texas, there is a checkbox on the death certificate for whether or not the deceased was diabetic, because they want to track this information. Makes sense. The problem is, as Hempstead found, there was only a 40% accuracy rate between that checkbox and that patient's medical records. Why? Why would there be such a disconnect?
Who's filling in the check? That's the question.
Who's checking the box? Is it the coroner? Is it a mortician? Who is it that's filling out the death certificate? And do they actually have access to this patient's medical
And are
information?
they willing to spend the time to look if they do have access?
That's exactly right. So this actually 40% accuracy is actually only 40% of known diabetics had diabetic checked on their death certificate. That's not highly accurate. Also, we see this a lot in civics, in polling. In Florida in 2004 and in Colorado in 2008, there was a large number of voters who had their ballots tossed out because they did not check the box that confirmed that they were a citizen. Despite the fact that to enter the polling station, they had to be registered to vote, which included a signed affidavit that they were a citizen. So we can safely assume that the vast majority of these people who didn't check that box were actually citizens, otherwise they would not be allowed into the polling place. But their votes were nullified because they just didn't check the box.
Did it sway the election?
No, but, well, not the general election,
Did
but it could have affected ballot
Colorado.
initiatives.
both of those are Swedes?
Oh, that's a good point. Both of those are swing states. I can give you the references, though. You can follow up on it. Okay, so checkboxes, although they improved accuracy, they also introduced this ambiguity. So if I were to spell out conflation theory, which is my new little toy theory to explain this difference, it would say that the number of unchecked checkboxes is actually two values that are summed. This is starting to look like generalizability theory, isn't it? Okay. But then there's a competing theory which is more established called the default theory. This is an interesting study that they conducted in hospitals with elderly, terminally ill patients. And they gave them a questionnaire regarding end-of-life decisions. So if you can think of any larger magnitude decision that somebody should be making. And what they found is that depending on how the questions were worded, what was the default response, the patients would gravitate one way or the other. They would gravitate towards that default response. And if they worded the question so that there was no implied response, they would get a mean value directly in between those two extremes. So the default effect would say that anytime there's a default response, like a checkbox offers, people will tend to that, above and beyond just non-response. Okay? In this case, this was a forced response scenario where it's an individual giving the survey and won't take no for an answer. Well, will take no for an answer, but won't take no response for an answer. Now, what was the term, Dr. Subbix, that you said? The acquiescence?
Acquiescence response set.
Acquiescence response set is what we would call this measurement. All right. So my research question was quite simple. Does conflation effect adequately explain the observed difference between items with and without default responses? Or does it take something more, for example, default effect as opposed to conflation effect? The design is pretty simple. Let's create an online survey that's on a trivial, innocuous topic: advertising, sports teams, recent history, political issues, whatever. And randomly assign the students to either a yes/no radio button format or an unchecked checkbox format. So same questions, but some of them are going to get checkboxes, and the rest are going to get yes/no radio buttons. What do you think? Sound easy? Sound feasible? Okay. Well, great. Our analysis would be simple because conflation theory basically says that non-responses and negative responses will appear as negative responses in a checkbox. So all we have to do is compare the level, the absolute level of affirmative responses, and we could test this with a t-test, right? As long as we make sure to count the non-responses as negative responses. We could test this with a t-test. Also, I don't know if Dr. Subbix remembers the Scott eyeball test. This was a phrase that he coined, in 2001. In this room, in our statistics class, back when IP and T really taught that statistics class, because there was a woman in the class of the last name Scott. And she had a tendency to say, or to point out that many of the data sets we were working with, the difference was so obvious that you didn't need to run the statistical test. So we called it the Scott eyeball test. See, I was an impressionable young PhD student who has never forgotten the Scott eyeball test. But
made it into the notes.
Made it into the notes, yeah. Exactly. Okay, so ready? Let's go. Let's run the study. Oh, wait. We have a little problem. What could possibly stand in the way of such a straightforward research design?
We'll take you more than one box.
Okay, well, we didn't even get to that point yet. We haven't even offered the survey yet. Thank you, IRB. Here's the problem. And I couldn't have in my informed consent that, hey, the purpose of this survey is to compare checkboxes and radio buttons. That would contaminate the pool. At the same time, I'm not allowed to deceive the participants. You can deceive participants per the IRB. It's automatically a level 3 review. So you only have one shot a month to go through the IRB. And you have to have in there the protocol that you will reveal to them the deception at the end of their participation. The problem is they get to choose when the end of their participation is. And if it's an online survey, they do that by closing the window, thereby prohibiting you from saying, no, wait, no, this survey wasn't really about what it was. So the IRB basically said, nope, can't do it. The end. Questions?
And yet you still stand here before us.
Yes, I do. Well, but I shifted gears, and I went back to my dissertation to try to find another research track. My dissertation was on self-efficacy, which I justified as being a predictor of whether or not teachers will perform a task as opposed to whether or not they can. A lot of research and education looks at teachers and whether or not they can do something. But I was focusing on dispositions to see whether or not they would do something. Besides confidence, one of the other dispositions I had identified was perceived value. Does the, in this case, pre-service teacher actually think what they're learning is of value? Because if they don't, it will probably impact their eventual in-class performance. So I created a new study, with a new research question. Do pre-service teachers' perceptions of value change as they progress through an educational certification program? So the design was to create an online survey for pre-service teachers and list out all of the courses that we offered for credit, both in our department and elsewhere on campus. And ask them, first, which of these classes would you take even if it didn't count for credit? See, I'm trying to get, do they value the information that's being taught in these courses? Once they'd gone through these courses, on the next page of the survey, it asked, which of these courses have you taken? So that then I could check, do students' perceptions of value change one way or the other after they've taken a class? What about throughout the program? Do they come to realize certain skills and knowledge are valuable? Here's the kicker. When I submitted it to the IRB, I said, I need to check the sanity of the data, as I put it. And I did two things. One is, along with the 49 courses that were real, I listed 6 fake courses. The idea being that if a student checks that they have taken one of these fake courses that have never been taught on campus, then I know that their responses might be somewhat suspect. My favorite fake course was EDI 404, Educational Technology. Because if you've ever mistyped a URL, you get a 404 error, because the file wasn't found. And so that was the number of the course, EDI 404. The other thing, though, that I did was I wanted to make sure that the format of the survey was not affecting the responses I was getting. So the students were randomly assigned to either checkboxes or radio buttons. And this was approved by the IRB.
So you're not allowed to deceive students, but you are allowed to deceive the IRB.
I did not deceive the IRB. I did not deceive the IRB. Let's get me on record. I did not deceive the IRB. My colleague, Tom Giblin, who is an outstanding researcher, former superintendent in 3 different major cities, he was the one who helped me design this research. And really, the idea of radio buttons versus checkboxes was kind of ancillary at that point. We really wanted to, we were trying to improve the program. Okay. I included this radio buttons versus checkboxes split, partially because it was really easy for me to do. I mean, we conducted the survey on my own server. But also because I was aware of this issue. And I wanted to, just see if it happened to occur in this case. So the IRB greenlights this research. We had 99 pre-service teachers respond. We incentivized it with a random drawing for a $25 gift certificate to the bookstore. Okay. I got, out of that 99, 80 of them responded within the first 48 hours after we'd sent out an email to the 300 teachers in our program. It worked out to be 45 were checkbox surveys and 44 were radio button surveys. 85% female, which is typical. It was very representative of our population. And 55% were childhood education as opposed to adolescent education. And again, that matched the demographics of the program. So the first thing I did when I got the data back was, hey, let's make a chart to see whether or not checkboxes versus radio buttons made a difference. So on the y-axis here, you have the percentage of endorsement or agreement, the yes. And then you have the items from 0 to 55, being that there were 55 courses. And then again, for the have you taken it, 0 to 55. Now the Scott eyeball test should tell you there's something going on here. Right? The dotted line is the checkboxes, the solid line is the radio buttons. So I went back to the IRB. I said, hey, listen, you know that data I gathered? I'd like to reanalyze it for this purpose. It's not going to pose any new threats to the students. It's totally innocuous, and they came back to me and said, yeah, go ahead, you can do that. Now that you've got the data, I see some smiles. I see some smiles, but you're going to have to trust me on my sincerity on this one. Okay, it's kind of worked out in my favor. So again, let's review. Conflation theory would say that the absolute number of agrees should be the same between radio buttons and checkboxes, because the radio button non-responses get lumped together with the negative responses over here. Right? Well, let's look at the data. Yeah, there's no conflation effect here. Right, so in the checkboxes, you can see we had below a 20% agreement rate. And for the radio buttons, it was above 40%. You can see there was about 7% missing or so, but it doesn't adequately explain the difference between these two formats. And here's the actual statistics. Now I am counting each data point in my N because, well, if I'm looking at missing, for example, missing items or skipped items, I can't do it on a participant basis because the participant responded to some of the items. But what that does is that greatly decreases my standard deviation because I've got this massive N. Any guesses on what the p-value would be between those two? It is huge. I mean, it's 6 zeros. So, the conclusion, conflation effect theory is bunk, and default theory is awesome. No discussions needed. The end. Thank you for your time.
Is that really the end this time, or?
No, I'm not sincere this time. I was sincere when I proposed that study to the IRB. Let's come back to this chart. What's something that you notice?
The second half, the questions, did they actually take
This is,
functions differently?
Here, I actually have that right there. So this is have you taken that class? What do you notice?
The checkboxes and radio buttons match up pretty well with the have you, but in hypothetical would you, something is going on.
Yeah. This is hypothetical or a statement of preference, declaration of preference or something, but when it was factual, they seem to track pretty closely. The research, like for example that one that was done in the hospital, into the default effect, they were looking at statements of preference, which is what we have over here, but not statements of fact. So hey, let's take a look at this. Let's break it down even more. So if we only look at the preference items, so we have half as many items listed here. You can see this huge difference between radio buttons and checkboxes in terms of their endorsement rate. And their standard deviations are still small. P-value, again, very, very small. So we reject the null hypothesis, I guess, forcefully with, what's the term they use in court, with prejudice. We reject it with prejudice. And if we were to map it out, again, this is preference items only. Looks very similar to that overall list. With the checkbox endorsement rate here, radio button endorsement rate there. The the conflation theory does not adequately explain this difference. But let's look at the factual recall items. Look at that mean. Right. So these means are so very close, as are their standard deviations, that the p-value is close to 0.9. And so it appears that the conflation effect might actually operate. And if we look at the bar chart of that data, look at what happens. The sum of the missing data and the negative responses is equal to the negative responses in the checkboxes. Hey, look, we found something that works. We found something that works. But here's where it gets complicated, right? Those t-tests are fine and dandy. How would we actually, though, tease out what's going on here statistically? What would you use? This is called wait time. Do you know of any statistical measures that we could shoehorn this into?
What exactly what research question are you asking?
Well, the problem is that we saw, if you go back to the original research question as to whether or not the conflation effect was sufficient to explain the observed difference, right? When we looked at the whole data set, we said no. When we looked at the hypothetical preference items, we said no, it doesn't. But then when we looked at the factual recall, we said, wait, it does. Is there one way that we could take So what do we have? We have a variable that is the format of the item, radio button versus checkboxes, and we have a variable that is the cognitive task that they're being asked to perform. Is there a way that we could look at the individual impact, choosing my words carefully, the individual impact that each one of those variables has, and then maybe do they cooperate to bring about another? So what am I getting at? What
Would you for interaction?
you look for interaction? Okay.
Is that what you're going to say when you said cooperate?
Yes, exactly. They cooperate to bring about another. But impact, what would be a better term?
Prediction.
Prediction. Okay. Effect, maybe. Right. It's all getting at analysis of variance, right? And so I looked at this. Wow, a two-way ANOVA. I can throw in these two independent variables of item format and cognitive task, and then have the dependent variable being the endorsement rate, and I can tease out kind of like sources of error in G-theory. Well, it's more complicated than that because my participants either participated in radio buttons or checkboxes. It wasn't crossed. They all, though, did both types of cognitive tasks. So in collaboration with Dr. Sudwick's, we decided that repeated measures ANOVA would work. The idea being that if we looked at, repeated measures, usually you measure them once, you measure them twice, you measure them 3 times. Well, we actually did 2 measures. It just happened to be in the same city. Okay. So measure 1, the first measurement period, was the hypothetical preference items. The second measure was the factual recall, have you taken this class? And then, so that's within subjects. That's our within subjects variable. But then we also have our between subjects factor, which normally in repeated measures, this would be something like gender, that you feed in as a between subjects. It's a variable that distinguishes between your participants. And in this case, what distinguished between them was whether it was checkboxes or radio buttons. Now, we expect there to be an effect on checkboxes versus radio buttons because our t-test showed overall there was a significant difference. Up here as well on the within subjects, meaning was it an item of preference or factual recall, we would also expect to find a significant effect because they're not the same question, right? And but then the whole reason for this this analysis is not necessarily to establish those effects, but to see if they interact, which is actually an effect. Dr. Sudwick's will remember I talked about precise speech. It's not really an interaction per se, but is there a task by format effect? So let's see what happens. First of all, and this is what happens every time I run an analysis of variance, it failed both of the assumptions. The data did not meet the assumptions. The covariances were not equal, which analysis of variance is actually fairly robust against that, from what I understand. So what I did was I just decreased my critical p-value quite a ways. Second of all, it failed Mauchly's test for sphericity. There's a word for you. It's almost as nice as kurtosis. But essentially, to mitigate that, I chose to go with the most conservative within subjects test, right? Which is actually really funny. I have the data up here. All of the tests came out with the same numbers. So, what did we find? All right, now I'm scared. I feel like I'm going to make dissertation defense again, and Dr. Sudwick is adding up my columns to make sure that I did this right. And I'm not sure that I did. But we have one ANOVA table for the between subjects effect, which was...
So checkbox versus...
Checkbox versus radio buttons, exactly. And what we find is that it did have a significant effect, which we thought it would. By the way, I only checked out to 6 zeros, but this did go out to 6 zeros, and in this case, in that case. And then within subjects effects, then task being the cognitive process, was it preference or was it factual recall? We found it to be, well, per my a priori critical threshold, not significant, but still p of 0.005, that's pretty low. But then for task by format, we did find a significant effect, which means that the applicability of the default versus the conflation effect depends, in this case, on what the cognitive task was that the respondent had to perform. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so my conclusions. The conflation effect adequately explained the observed difference for factual recall. The conflation effect did not adequately explain the observed difference for preference. Why? I don't know. Why? And I'm sincere. So I don't know why. What do you think?
Cognitively, the process of memory functions different than the process of speculation.
Okay, so what we're saying, though, by the default effect, right, is that people gravitate towards the default response. But that seems not to operate when it's factual recall.
Maybe to do with factual recall takes a little bit more mental effort.
Or less. Different amount, but it's a different process, right? If we can imagine the neural pathways, right, that are being followed with each of these processes, apparently one of them has the default effect, or is affected more by the default effect than the other.
When I think when it comes to preference too, I'm often asked questions where I don't really actually have an opinion. My wife wanted to know last night if she should curl her hair or leave it straight. I got in trouble because I said,
You look just fine to me.
You're beautiful both ways. I thought that that was actually a really nice response. I was wrong. And so that was a case where having a default position would have been wonderful because I would have gone with the default. So that
This looks good, doesn't it?
yeah.
I don't need to curl my hair, do I?
The way it is right now is so. I mean, in cases of preference, I can see if I don't really have a strong preference, I'm going to go with the default.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Now, we would hope that somebody making end-of-life decisions wouldn't be as susceptible to that, but who knows? You know, maybe at that point they really don't, you know, have one way or the other.
I can kind of see a parallel between, like, an assessment we talk about typical performance versus best performance. And when you're asked to do something that actually happened, you might put a little bit more effort into making sure you do it correctly rather than something that is hypothetical, like I don't have to put as much thought into it, I'm just going to check a box, whatever it is. You're giving your best performance when you're asked to do something that is factual, and maybe not put so much effort into something that's hypothetical.
That's actually what we were talking about, and this gets into default theory, is framing. Right? What's the frame within which the respondent is operating? That's a very good point. Yeah, that's possible. Any other hypotheticals or theories or hypotheses? Well, I don't know for sure, but I can show you some data that actually speaks to what we were talking about. This is time to completion on the survey. This is one of the coolest parts about doing online surveys, is that you can tell how long it took them. But be prepared to see some high values at the far end because people will just leave it open and go get a glass of water. Or actually, I was looking at time to completion on some online courses, and there was one page somebody was on for like 48 hours. And as near as we can tell, she just left it up and went to bed and, you know, went and did some other stuff and came back a couple days later. It was still open and the timer's still clicking. But so if we line up all of the respondents from the ones who finished the quickest to the ones who finished the slowest, the dotted line is for checkboxes, the dashed line is for radio buttons. What does it tell you? Which takes longer? The radio buttons take longer. Okay? And in my opinion, this difference of 2 or 3 minutes is actually more significant than just simply the fact that to say no to a checkbox takes no action. You just scroll past it. And whereas to say no to a radio button actually is an action. So the radio button people had to click 55 times on one page and then click 55 times on the other. But this difference here, I think, speaks to, again, this cognitive load. The idea that it's the people responding with a radio button, meaning responding with a radio button, actually takes more effort and time than to a checkbox. So you're actually crossing the item format load with the preference versus factual recall cognitive task load. We also see that radio buttons might take a little more cognitive task in the number of skipped items. Now, why don't I have any skipped items for my checkboxes?
Because an uncheck is...
Because we don't know they skipped them. Yeah, an unchecked checkbox would count as a no. Okay. But if you look at the radio buttons, we actually had twice as many radio buttons skipped on the second half of the survey than we did skipped on the first half of the survey, which speaks to some sort of fatigue as they're going through these 55 courses and doing it twice. All right, so my recommendations: restrict the use of checkboxes on surveys. Okay, don't use them for preference items because you run into that default effect. And for factual items, they're a little safer to use, but you need to be certain that the conflation effect doesn't pose a risk, meaning that you can assume somebody who skips that item meant no as their response. Does anyone know of any opportunities when you might want to leverage the conflation and the default effect? You've all done it. You've all participated. You've ever installed software and they'll have some things checked by default, right? The opt-in forms, they often leverage both the default and the conflation. They think that, hey, it's already checked, I'm good with that, that would be the default effect, or I didn't even see the checkbox, that would be the
Did I
conflation
just
effect.
accidentally installed the Ask toolbar?
Yeah,
on
and then
Google
you have three
Chrome,
toolbars on
and
your
then
browser.
That's not what I want. Dang it.
My favorite is when they actually have the unchecked checkboxes and in the bottom of the window, but if you scroll down, that's where all the checked ones are, and so you actually have to scroll to see. It's kind of deceitful, but at the same time, they're leveraging these psychological effects. All right, now here's the deal with this study. It's been floundering for about a year. If any of you have expertise in ANOVA and want a quick co-authorship, I'll throw you on there. And so just send me an email if you're interested. I've got the entire lit review written, the methods are written, it's pretty much just the results that need to be written up. And then we would find an avenue to publish it. And this time, I really mean it. That's the end. Thank you.
All right, questions for Dr. Browne?
Wow, so insanely interesting and inspiring.